I got a question for you. Which one of these is better? Zeal or knowledge? While you're thinking about that, you might want to turn to 2 Samuel 6, where our scripture reading was from. That's the idea we're going to be discussing as we go throughout this evening. Zeal, enthusiasm, the want, the willingness to go and pursue something, or knowledge, the truth, the facts of the situation, the objective reality of the thing to pursue. Which one of those is better? Of course, you probably have an answer to that in your mind, but rather than it just be me telling you an answer or you just guessing an answer, let's look at Scripture and see what God would happen to recommend. Now, I attribute the words zeal and knowledge in this passage primarily because they're familiar concepts from a passage like Romans, where Paul talks about zeal and knowledge in Romans 10, and yes, that probably informs some of your decision making on this topic. We'll get there in a minute, or at least we'll talk about those ideas. Because in 2 Samuel 6, this is the story in which David is moving the Ark of God back into Jerusalem with him so that God and the king are together in the same place. God has a proverbial seat at the table in Jerusalem. He hasn't had that in a long time. He wasn't with Saul, but now that David is established, it's time to bring God back into the country. And this is the story of them trying and failing and trying again to move that ark and make this work. Here you'll see some zeal, some enthusiasm. Here you'll see some knowledge, some actual facts of the situation. And between those two, you'll see an indication of what God is looking for when he's asking his people to act. And so as we read this story, and as you consider this story, I want you to think about what God is trying to push you towards when you're considering the things of the Lord. Let's start reading in 2 Samuel chapter 6. We'll start reading in verse 1. John read those first 6 verses for us. We'll read through those and then continue and finish out the rest of this chapter. 2 Samuel 6, starting in verse 1. Now David again assembled all the young fit men in Israel, 30,000 of them. He and all his troops set out to bring the ark of God from Baal, Judah. And the ark bears the name of the Lord of armies, who is enthroned between the cherubim. They set the ark of God on a new cart and transported it from Abinadab's house, which was on the hill. Uzzah and Ahio, the sons of Abinadab, were guiding the cart, and they brought it with the ark of God from Abinadab's house on the hill. Ahio walked in front of the ark. David and the whole house of Israel were dancing before the Lord with all kinds of wooden instruments and lyres, harps, tambourines, sistrums, and cymbals. But when they came to Nachon's threshing floor, Uzzah reached out to the ark of God, and he took hold of it, because the oxen had stumbled. Then the Lord's anger burned against Uzzah, and God struck him dead on the spot for his irreverence, and he died there before the ark of God. Now, David was angry because of the Lord's outburst against Uzzah, so he named that place the outburst against Uzzah, or Perez Uzzah, as it is today. And David feared the Lord that day. He said, "How can the ark of God ever come back to me?" So he was not willing to bring the ark of the Lord to the city of David. Instead, he diverted it to the house of Obed-Edom of Gath, and the ark of the Lord remained in his house 3 months. And the Lord blessed Obed-Edom and his whole family. Verse 12, it was then reported to King David, "The Lord has blessed Obed-Edom's family and all that belongs to him because of the ark of God." So David went and had the ark of God brought up from Obed-Edom's house to the city of David with rejoicing. And when those carrying the ark of the Lord advanced 6 steps, he sacrificed an ox and a fattened calf. David was dancing with all his might before the Lord, wearing a linen ephod. He and the whole house of Israel were bringing up the ark of the Lord with shouts and the sound of the ram's horn. And as the ark of the Lord was entering the city of David, Saul's daughter Michal looked down from the window and saw King David leaping and dancing before the Lord, and she despised him in her heart. They brought the ark of the Lord and set it in its place inside the tent that David had pitched for it. Then David offered burnt offerings and fellowship offerings in the Lord's presence. When David had finished offering the burnt offering and the fellowship offerings, he blessed the people in the name of the Lord of armies, and he distributed a loaf of bread, a date cake, and a raisin cake to each one in the entire Israelite community, both men and women. Then all the people went home. And in verse 20, when David returned home to bless his family, Saul's daughter Michal came out to meet him. "How the king of Israel honored himself today," she said. "He exposed himself today in the sight of the slave girls of his subjects like a vulgar person might expose himself." David replied to Michal, "It was before the Lord who chose me over your father and his whole family to appoint me a ruler over the Lord's people Israel. I will dance before the Lord, and I will dishonor myself and humble myself even more. However, even by those slave girls you spoke about, I will be honored." And Saul's daughter Michal had no child to the day of her death. When you read that all in one section, it sounds kind of weird a little bit. Up until recently, up until really this past week when I've been thinking about this, I've really split that into two parts. There's the moving the ark part, and then there's that whole section at the end with Michal ridiculing David. I think it's very closely interconnected, and there's a reason it's part of the same story, but we'll talk about that when we get there, which is going to be naturally at the end. What you see when you go through this story, you see several main characters. Primarily, it's going to be Uzzah, David, and ultimately Michal, and we'll talk about those three as we go. But you see those three stand as representations of different sorts of attitudes towards the Lord. And the first one you have to think about is an attitude of zeal alone, a kind of enthusiastic, overwhelming want for God, which is admirable in its own right, but when you think about it, it's not really enough because the first 11 verses end in disaster. The main characters of this section are David and Uzzah. They go out and they have this plan. They're going to move the Ark of God from out in the countryside back to Judah, back to Jerusalem, to the capital city. Israel's finally established. David's the king, and he's ready to bring God back to him and unite with God in this monarchy of sorts. But it doesn't work because there are two primary problems. And the first one you have to say is they've got a problem in how they move the ark. Did God have any commands on how you were supposed to move the ark? And the answer is yes. The Ark of the Covenant is addressed in Numbers chapter 4, verses 5 and 6. God says you're supposed to cover the ark with something. And then you get Kohathites, who are a branch of the Levites, you get them to put poles in the ark and carry that on their shoulders. That doesn't happen in 2 Samuel chapter 6. It's a very common thing to point out. In verse 3, they put the ark on a new cart. It's interesting that that's specified a new cart because the last time the ark was put on a new cart, that was from the Philistines in 1 Samuel 6 in verse 7. And so instead of following God's instruction on how you should move the ark, David instead follows the Philistine example of putting the ark on a cart and having it shipped off somewhere. And we look at David and we look at his heart, and David wants to honor God. David wants to bring God back. David has all these good goals in mind, and then he pursues those goals like the Philistines pursued them. And you say there's a bit of a disconnect there because that's not how it ought to work. He has an end goal of bringing God close, and it's a good goal. But the ends do not justify the means. And his means of getting there are very worldly. And it doesn't matter that it's probably more convenient. It doesn't matter that he has popular opinion. He's got 30,000 people who are doing this with him. It doesn't matter that he's appealing to other people's example. The Philistines got away with it, so surely we can as well. None of those things matter because God has said you pick up the ark. This specific group of people picks up the ark and takes it somewhere, and David doesn't follow through. There's your first sin. That's the first issue in this section, that David ignores the will of God to try and fulfill the want to be close to God. It's a strange paradox. The second issue is pretty much like it, and what you'll often notice is sometimes when you sin, that sin leads to other sins, and this is one of those instances, because there's this whole problem with steadying the ark. In verse 6, as the oxen who are pulling the ark, as they get into the threshing floor, they hit some kind of snag and the cart jostles and the ark is about to fall over. And so Uzzah, who's driving the cart, he has this choice to make. Do I reach out and steady the ark and keep the ark upright, or do I let the ark fall over? Well, Numbers chapter 4 and verse 15 said you were supposed to put a covering on the ark because if you touch the ark, you're going to die. But Uzzah thinks he has a good heart. He wants to honor God. He wants to keep the ark from falling over. He wants to keep God respected. If I just grab the corner of it, surely it's not going to be a problem. But that's against what God had said. So in his pursuit of honoring God, he goes outside, or rather, he goes against the law of God, and we all know what happens to him. He's struck down. David names the whole place after him. It's the place where God struck down Uzzah. That is permanently enshrined on the land because Uzzah, even though he had this good, zealous, enthusiastic pursuit towards God, he's doing it in completely the wrong way. And so he's punished before it. There are people who zealously and sincerely and enthusiastically want a close relationship with God, and they go about it in completely the wrong way. And it's a common problem. You'll see it religiously. You've probably seen it some in your own life, personally or in people around you. People who are sincere, people who want to do the right thing, but ignore the rules that God has laid down. The lesson you learn when someone goes at this from a zeal alone and no knowledge perspective is that enthusiasm does not excuse your disobedience. And I'm glad that there are many people who want a relationship with God. And I'm glad that there are many people who are sincere in their want for that. But God has specified the way in which you attain a relationship with Him. And if we go outside of His rules, we won't get that relationship. There's a quote that is often attributed to things like this. I found it in a commentary by Warren Wiersbe. I don't think he's the first one who said it because I've heard it everywhere throughout the years, but I'll give it to him because he's the book I read on this. God's work must be done in God's way to receive God's blessings. If you have the end result of trying to get God close to you, but you do it in your own way, you're not going to receive the blessings of God on that. And so this first attempt ends in failure. The ark is abandoned somewhere else at somebody else's house. David doesn't think he can receive it. He's afraid of it. Maybe God's going to strike him too. And so he shoves the ark somewhere else and leaves it for a few months until he finds that the ark is blessing people. God's not just striking random people down. It's okay. Let's try it again. And this time, you see a great balance that David ends up having. Because it's not just enthusiasm anymore. And as David, who's the central character, as he goes out and pursues God, as he goes out and tries to gain this relationship with God again, you see a noted difference in how he goes about doing it. And it's kind of even just an afterthought in verse 13. It never says they put the ark on the shoulders of the Kohathites or anything like that. It doesn't get that specific. But it says in verse 13 that there were those who were carrying the ark. And you notice David has started from a very different place. He took 3 months to think about it, or maybe to get better educated about what he should have done in the first place. I don't know. And he ends up coming through with some knowledge. That is, I need to go out and actually have this carried by the right people. Because if we had listened to Numbers chapter 4, Uzzah wouldn't be dead. If we had listened to Numbers chapter 4, the ark would have already been in Jerusalem. We didn't do it the first time, but we can do it now. And so David takes that foundation, the knowledge God has given him, and has people carry it. God has given us the guide rails in how we're supposed to live. God's given these things called commandments. He's given these things called laws and rules. He's given those things to give us a framework that we can live within. Those are there for a reason. It's good to have a knowledge of what God says. And once you have a knowledge of what God says, then it's very appropriate to have zeal atop that. And so you see, once David begins to move the ark properly, once he begins to do what God said, once he begins to follow after the command that God has given, now he has the zeal to enjoy that process and to make it not just a process where he watches somebody carry the ark, but to make it a process where the entire land celebrates that the ark is moving back to Jerusalem. He dances and sings in front of it. He plays instruments. He is very joyous. He's joyous to such an extent that his wife is embarrassed about it. We'll talk about that in a few minutes here in the next section. You see his enthusiasm, and it's good to have it. It's good to have that kind of joy and willingness and eagerness to do the things of God because they have to be the things of God. And as soon as David's willing to align his will with God's will, now he's able to celebrate, and now he's able to draw attention to it, and now he's able to glorify God because he's working according to what God said. You can make a bunch of different applications of this. Here's just a very simple one. God tells us what to do a lot of times. He doesn't necessarily specify how to do it. And so, for example, you have a command to sing. He doesn't tell you how loud you can sing or how softly you should sing. That's your choice. He doesn't tell you how quickly or how slowly. He doesn't tell you melody only in Gregorian chant or, four-part harmony like most of our songs have. He doesn't care about those things. He hasn't specified. So you can do whatever you want to as long as you're singing because those are the rules that God has put in place. And having a healthy respect for the rules enables us to then take joy and take pride in following the rules and actually obeying the things of God. What you see about David, zeal alone does not cut it. But when David has a good balance of things, then it's very appropriate. What you have is enthusiasm being good within the confines of truth. Zeal is good within the boundaries God has laid. Enthusiasm is perfectly righteous if you're doing what God has actually said. There are a lot of people who start in this area, who have a respect for the things that God said, and then they get enthusiastic about it, and then somewhere along the way they kind of forget what God said. And you started from a good foundation, but in your happiness and in your joy, you suddenly forgot about the commands that God gave. Or the commands that God said, you shouldn't do that, or you should go and do that. And suddenly you start letting one or two of them slip because, you're wholehearted. You're enjoying yourself. You're trying to do the best for God, but not according to knowledge. That's what Paul references in Romans 10 in the early verses 2 or 3. People do have a zeal for God, but it's not kept in check by the knowledge of his truth. What God is demonstrating in this story is that there's a place for zeal. It's after you get a foundation in God's truth that then you can rejoice in those things. And so I would argue knowledge is more important than zeal. At least at first, knowledge is the baseline from which everything else stems. But if knowledge is to come first, if knowledge is that thing of first importance, then why don't we just try knowledge alone? Right? If knowledge is the solid one and zeal is the not recommended one, why don't we just do things according to our knowledge and not have any zeal whatsoever? That's what this last section is about. And that's how I think this all ties in, because you notice David has blessed everyone else. He's given freely to everyone else. And then he comes home intending to bless his family, and he can't do it because there's a naysayer at home. There's a lesson in there for us married people. You can make those applications. I don't need to get into that. But as you start in verse 20, or you see it in verse 15, verse 16, you see Michal, who's the daughter of King Saul, the previous king. Michal, who's the wife of David, she comes out and starts to speak against David. And so you see this story for just a few verses. It focuses on this couple. And I want you to see what Michal says, because it's very interesting when you look at the things that she is perceiving. In verse 16, she looks down from the window, and what does she see? She sees David leaping and dancing, and she despised him. In verse 20, what's her complaint? How the king of Israel honored himself today. That's sarcastic, if you couldn't tell. You exposed yourself. Why were you so ecstatic? In other words, did you really have to do all of that? Did you really have to embarrass our family like that? Did you really have to be so excited about that thing? This is not a complaint against God, I don't think. This is a complaint against David and David alone. Michael doesn't seem to be upset that the ark of God has returned to the city. That's not what she's complaining about. She's not complaining about the Lord's presence. She's not complaining about the religious thing that's just happened. She's complaining that David didn't have to do as much as he did. He could have been more restrained. He could have done less. He could have just not given as much. This is the attitude of, you have to do this. You have to do this base level of work. Why would you do anything more than that? I saw the ark come into the city. I was watching, I wasn't ignoring it, but I watched it from afar. I didn't have to go out into the street. I didn't have to go down and dance in front of it. I didn't have to proclaim its greatness in front of everyone. Everyone else can already see that. You can just sit back and let it go. This is the attitude of the person who says, God tells me to pray, so I pray once every day. You've technically fulfilled the requirement to pray to God, yes, but is that really what God is looking for? This is the person who says, God told me to assemble with the saints, so I went there for Sunday morning worship. Not Bible class, not Sunday evening, definitely not Wednesday night, or anything else during the week. That would be terrible. But I've technically fulfilled what I had to do. Therefore, it's enough. This is the attitude of the person who does the bare minimum. Do you think God is pleased with that? He commanded the bare minimum. Do you really think God wants people to stop with just the minimum? I think what you'll see in your life, when you see Christians who try to do as little as possible, what you see, that the indication that you get is truth without enthusiasm. It just kind of rings hollow. It's just kind of empty. I mean, it might be technically correct, but you get a sense that the person doesn't really care. It might be technically what God said, but you get a feeling that it's not that important to the person if they're not willing to go beyond just the bare minimum and do a little something else. I can know all of the commands of God, and I can fulfill all of the commands of God and still be lacking if I don't have a kind of zeal for Him, if I don't have a kind of passion for Him to want to engage in these things and want to do more than just read 15 minutes of the Bible a day. Maybe I want to push that a little bit and go a little further. Maybe I want to pray more than once a day. Maybe I want to assemble with the saints more than once a week. Maybe I want to do a little bit more for God. And unless we have that kind of attitude that I want to do more for Him, do we really have that kind of a sense that God's the most important thing in our life? Knowledge alone will not cut it, I don't think. And I don't think that's stating it too strongly either. You have Uzzah, who is zealous. He gets struck dead. He didn't have the knowledge. You have Michal, who has the knowledge. Notice her punishment in verse 23. It's interesting. I've always read verse 23 as this kind of idea that David just didn't like Michal anymore. I don't think that's what that is. Because you see, multiple times over, God uses the ability to give and take away childbirth as a punishment or a reward in different kinds of circumstances. Michal put in the bare minimum for God. So God left her alive, but He didn't give her life any joy in terms of childbirth or the meaning that's in that. I don't think God approves of this kind of an attitude. And so I would advocate a balance between the two of them. Now, I don't know exactly how to specify this, and there's no real way for me to quantify this in a way that's going to be understandable to everyone. And so instead, I don't think it's a 50-50 split, but I don't think it's a 99-1 split either. I'm not exactly sure how to say it, so I'll do my best to conclude, and if you have specific questions, please ask me afterwards, and let's work through some of those problems. Basically, the lesson of 2 Samuel 6 is summed up in these few words. God has laid out a foundation. We can understand that God has an expectation for us to fulfill. And he has two requirements that go along with that expectation. The first one is don't go outside the frame that he has put. God has established a framework. Don't go outside of his foundation. Don't go and build something else. You're not going to be inside of what God has said. But also, don't leave it as just that foundation, as just that framework. Over and over again in Ephesians chapter 2, for instance, Jesus is the cornerstone, the apostles are the foundation, and then we're to be built upon that to make it into a beautiful house for God. That's the idea. We're not supposed to leave it as just the framework, but take that framework that God has given and use it to build something fantastic. I think about it like a tent. You know how you construct a tent? You have two pieces to a tent. You have the frame and you have the cover. And if you're missing one of those, you're missing the tent. You can have the cover without a frame. You can have zeal without knowledge, but you have no idea what to do with it. It's just a big blanket at that point. It doesn't fulfill the work of a tent. You got something, but it's not going to work right. Or you can have the frame without the cover, and you have the structure, and the rain still comes in because there's nothing over it to protect you from that. This only works when you have the frame that's set up, and then you have the cover over it that makes it into something livable. It's not zeal or knowledge. It's not knowledge or zeal. It's zeal and knowledge. Zeal working with knowledge. Zeal that is led by and guided by and shaped by knowledge. God's truth is the framework that our lives are built around. But we better not be leaving that with the bare minimum. We better be doing a little something to pursue God in our own rights. So don't go outside of what he said, but don't merely leave it as just fulfilling the bare minimum requirement specifications and leaving it at that and going on your own way. God is looking for people who are willing to listen to him and who are willing to give him a bit more of their lives than just the core. If God is to be everything to us, then we have to put everything towards God. I think that's the message of 2 Samuel 6. And you can apply that in a variety of ways. We're not going to do that specifically, but I hope you take those principles and enshrine them in your head, because that can be useful, very useful, going forward. I don't know where you're at. I don't know what your kind of balance is. Maybe you're a zeal person who doesn't really regard the knowledge. You probably should. Maybe you're a knowledge person, but you don't really enthusiastically engage it. You probably should. God's looking for more from you than just your strict obedience. He's looking for you to love him and to go beyond just what is strictly required. So how can we help you to find that balance in a better way than you have it? How can we help you to pursue whichever element of that you're missing? And how can we help you find a good center point to be in so that God is pleased with how you live and how you act and everything you do? If there's anything we can do to help you, if there's anything we can do to push you towards God in any way, let me know. I'll be standing right here as we all stand and sing this song together.